Awesome. Lovely. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Luke Harrington, and this is my first GraphQL Summit. So can we all just give it up to the organizers? Awesome. So I'm here today to talk to you about some work I did at a former company working with NBC. We built a GraphQL API for them. It serves millions of people daily, and we're in production across platforms, iOS, Android, and web. So I just thought I would come, share my experiences, and then yeah, there's this weird component thing in there too. So we'll talk about that as well. Components is data. A cross-platform, GraphQL-powered component API. That's just a ton of buzzwords to get you all to come to my talk, and it looks like it worked, so awesome. Components. So let's start with components. They're these building blocks, these things that we see in our front ends these days. They're the fundamental chunks of UI that we use to compose our screens and our pages together. It's what makes up, it's the DNA of our apps, really. And they're everywhere. Components are good. They work. It doesn't matter if you're using React or Vue or Swift UI. If you're making a UI these days, you're most likely working with some kind of primitive like a component. And I think it's a good one. I think it's a great abstraction that we've found for building UI. Real quick recap about what a component is, because we're going to need to know it later, and then we'll get to some API stuff. Component, I like to use this pseudo math formula to describe a component. A component is a function of rendering props and state, and if you've seen React, you're going to recognize those words. But let's just drill down a little bit farther, just in case not everyone is familiar. I like to think of props as read-only external data that is given to your component. I like to think of state as local data that changes over time. And then obviously rendering these days is usually this declarative representation of the props and the state. So quick example. Here we have a switch component, right? And we have a label prop that is currently airplane mode, and then we have some state for on and off maybe, and then obviously the presentation of, okay, it's green when it's on. That's going to be, a detail of our render function. Okay, but that's not all components really do. The beautiful thing about components is that they compose together, like building blocks. So we could take our component here, our switch component, and add it to a row, and then we could take our row component and add it to a screen, and you basically have like a settings screen. I love components. They're a great abstraction. I genuinely love working with them. They feel like Legos, and like as a 90s kid, I'm into it. I think we're going to be building UIs with components for a long time. But this is an API talk. This is a API conference. Why are we talking about components? Well, I'll get there, but first I want to kind of build a case for what we've built for NBC. In any application, you're going to have kind of these building blocks. You're going to have a database. You'll have business logic of some sort, data fetching, third-party integration. You're going to have some feature flagging and A/B testing, a component library, obviously. And then you're going to have, your screen that stitches it all together into your pages, layout, and things like that. So when we come and we're going to build our app and we look at all these fundamental building blocks like databases and business logic and component libraries, we often are like, okay, let's use like a decoupled architecture here. And I don't think that is rare at a GraphQL conference, right? GraphQL is a great way to decouple your data from your front ends. But I think that when we're asking these questions about decoupling our applications, we often skip over where to decouple our applications. And I think that it's just kind of assumed that we would decouple pretty close to the data, right? And so I want to use this, our friend, the decouple line, to describe some different options for where you can decouple an application. And we'll get to what components as data looks like a little bit later. So as you move the decouple line around your application, you're going to see your API expose different types of things. It's going to have different features. There's going to be different pros and cons. OK, so let's start with, I think, the most typical place that you might decouple an application. And I think it's the one that you're all probably most familiar with. And that is pretty close to the database. In your typical stack these days with Apollo and React and TypeScript, you're generally going to decouple the data from the business logic and data fetching from in your front end. Your API is going to be very data model centric. You're going to be sending authors and posts and these kinds of things that are nouns, right? And this is a really great approach. It leaves a lot for front ends to handle, that's for sure. The front ends now are writing all of the business logic, all of the third-party API fetching. Maybe you could pull some of that into the graph as well. But it certainly leaves a lot for front ends to do. And we've seen this explosion of these large front-end code bases because of that, because everything that was in our Rails app or whatever before has been moved into React and into front ends. This is a great approach and one that I think a lot of us use. But if you move the decouple line over a bit and include some of the business logic in your API, you also have things start to get kind of interesting. And I think that this is what a good REST API. This is what a good REST API does. It's more than just exposing data or resources. It's going to expose, business logic. It's going to do more than just do CRUD on data, right? And don't worry, I won't talk about REST the entire talk, but I will say that there's something to Helios, which is Hypermedia as an engine of application state, where you can start to kind of let your API describe not just the data, but the operations that can happen on that data. Really basic example of that in a lot of REST APIs that you all have probably seen is pagination. I think pagination is a very simplistic Helios example, where with your response, you're going to send these links. Maybe in the JSON API format does this. You can send a self link, a next link, previous, last, right? And the existence of those fields will drive your UI, right? So if there's a next field here, then you need a next button. And in that way, you're letting the API drive the state of your front end. And that can get really powerful when you start wiring up pieces of your business logic to these links, where the API tells you, hey, you just published this thing. I'm going to send you information about how to unpublish it so that you could swap that out if it ever changes over time. I think it's a great thing. I do think there's a place for these types of APIs. So let's move the decouple line over a bit farther. Why are you laughing? No. So if we move the decouple line all the way over, we don't really have an API anymore, right? This is not an API. But we do have a monolith. And I want to address the elephant in the room, I guess. I think that monolith has become this low-grade insult in our industry, and especially in our circle. It's like the last thing that you want to hear about your app is that it's monolithic. And I think that's a little bit unfair to monoliths. But I do get it. A lot of us have worked on that big .NET app that's been around for 12 years, and maybe it was not fun, and it was very difficult to maintain, and it was legacy. That's another really oof, Ugh, legacy. But I think that this is a little bit of a guilt by association. We've had these bad experiences with very large things, and then we kind of drew the conclusion that, well, then the small thing might be better. And let me tell you, the size of your software has no correlation with how good your software is. In fact, if you take a monolith and split it up into microservices, and it's a poorly written monolith, now you have two problems. You have a poorly written app that communicates over the network. So you didn't really do anything to help yourself from pain in maintaining your application. Maybe monolith is the right call for some types of apps. That's all I'm saying. Don't at me. Okay, so I'll stop defending the monolith. And let's move the decouple line over here. So this is a weird one. Like, what kind of API, what kind of architecture has the database in the front end? What kind of, well, it's a local first app. It's an offline first app, right? And I don't think this is the first design that we reach for when we're designing our applications, but I think it should be on the table for two reasons. The first reason is, in a world where consumers' data is a commodity that is basically owned by corporations and sold to the highest bidder, maybe we should give data back to the users and give them their power back, give them their privacy back. I'll get off my soapbox now. But there's another good reason, too, that you might want to do something like this. You always hear these stories about, like, we have someone that goes out and works in the field, and they don't have good, connection. And I don't know where this field is that has bad connection, but I don't want to be there, that's for sure. I need my 4G. But there is a big use case in that case where someone is going out to either a low bandwidth or poor connection area, and they have to continue doing the work with their software. So building a local first or offline first application is a great way to serve their needs. It's a architecture that we should put on the table. And the API that you build ends up really being a way to synchronize distributed databases instead of sending formatted data on the wire. And that's a hard problem to solve, don't get me wrong, but it's one that we should probably consider. Okay, finally, let's get to what we're here to talk about. Components as data. So if we move the decouple line between the component library and the rendering, we have components as data. And this is the part that I've found is hard to describe, so I'm going to give you all some examples. But basically, what you're able to do is decouple rendering from components and describe your components as JSON. So let's give an example. This is the most basic example I could think of. The hero component, right? Almost all of us probably have something like this. This is a components as data example. We have this field called component. And this is kind of like a special field that we're going to use to map in our front end to the actual component. Then we have the respective data. This data is passed as props to the component when we need to render it. So these are things that a hero might care to see, like a title, background image, and a subtitle. Okay, let's see if it works. It worked, okay. So this is the exact pattern that we used when building NBC.com. NBC.com serves millions of people daily, and if it's the Super Bowl, then it's tens of millions of people daily. Here up top, we have a slideshow with some slides, and we have, some shelves full of tiles, right? Pretty like you're familiar with this type of UI for a media streaming app. So we use this pattern to build NBC. What we started with was a very data model-centric API. And this was great. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm actually not saying that there's anything wrong with any of these patterns. It served us very well, but what it did was it left a lot for the front-end teams to do. All of these front-end teams who are building largely the same app, were repeating all of the same business logic, all of the same third-party API calls, all the same A/B tests and feature flags. It was, if we wanted to roll out a feature, it was weeks and weeks of work. So we moved the decouple line over a bit, and we kind of took like a BFF kind of approach, where we built a GraphQL API, and we built some more of the business logic into the API, and each front end kind of had their own response that they could get. And this worked great, but then they dropped the personalization bomb on us. And the personalization bomb was, well, we want to be able to show a completely custom homepage to any given user. We want to be able to dynamically render, based on a feature flag or an A/B test or a personalization feature, a different homepage for everyone, completely custom, dynamic. So at that point, we realized that we're still giving a lot of work for the front ends, to the front ends. So we moved the decouple line over, and I think we found a really good abstraction. So these are kind of like some of the, I guess, components that you might see in the NBC.com homepage. This is definitely a pared down list. It's certainly more complicated than this. But you have your slideshow that has slides generally. You have your shelf that is, has series tiles and videos tiles for episodes and clips and things like that. So why did we go with GraphQL for this, this kind of API? Well, first, we didn't have to. There's nothing about this API format that we need GraphQL for. But, and I hear this over and over again with GraphQL, the types and the queries, the way that the types and the queries work together in this like beautiful harmony, they come together, and it was perfect for our, for describing our component library, the schema of it. It was the perfect contract between the front end and the back end, this type system that GraphQL has. So, what do the types look like? Well, let's dig in. So, this is kind of like a pared down version of our schema. We have an interface called component, and it has, that component field that we talked about. It's going to contain the name of the component. We created this other field called treatment, and you could think of treatment as kind of like class or class name, right? It's this cross-platform idea that this component is a variant of itself, right? Because iOS doesn't have classes, right? This needs to be able to work across platforms. So we created this treatment field that kind of, you can kind of modify, say, primary or secondary, right? Then we have our video tile that implements component, and it contains video data. And this is, we kind of decoupled the data from the component itself in a similar way that you would decouple your types for your props in a component from the component itself, right? So you have your typical video types of fields here: image, title, percent viewed. We have our series tile, very similar. And then you can see that we union our video tile and series tile together and say, hey, a shelf can contain items of tiles. So a shelf can have items of video tiles or series tiles. And you kind of see what we're doing here, right? We're starting to kind of build up the schema for our UI. And then we can introduce these other types of things like a section interface. And it's really similar to component, but it's going to be slightly different because the reality is that you sometimes want to treat certain components differently. And you'll see where that comes in. So slideshows is going to be part of the featured interface, and shelf will be part of the sections interface. And it's like loosely related to layout. So we have our slideshow with our slides. And in here, we can kind of stitch it together with, and in our case, we created a full page type here. The page is basically, if you can remember what the home page looked like that I showed you, it's that top featured section, and then there's a bunch of shelves, an array of sections here. And you remember those sections can be a shelf with tiles in it. And then finally, we have our query, where we're going to receive the name, user ID, and platform. Return a page. OK, so what does it look like to work with this? Well, you could kind of imagine it based on the schema here. But when we're querying for our page, we can pass in, hey, I want to get the home page, and I want to get this user on platform web or iOS or what have you, right? And when we go and get the data, this is what it looks like to get like a tree of UI back as JSON. So we have our featured and sections fields that we described. The component is slideshow with data of slides, right? And then we have sections, which are the shelf with tiles. In this case, we have series tiles that are recommendations, right? So top picks for you. This is us, keeping up with the Kardashians, blacklist, things like that, right? But you don't just have to send pages. In fact, requesting an entire page might be a little bit of overkill. It could be a very large response. So you could just build a resolver for a given feature in your app. So this continue watching shelf is an example of that. Continue watching is what it might sound like. It's like picking back up where you left off on a video, right? So that's going to return a shelf naturally. So for this user, back in our resolvers, we're going back to our data sources, getting user data, going and fetching videos, and then structuring this response of, hey, here's our shelf, the title is continue watching, and here's the video tiles, right? So I think what we have here is this like design schema, right? Where we've essentially described the tree of our UI in a schema. And I think when we're building, things like design systems, this is what we wish we could do. We wish we could be this descriptive. So now the other cool thing about using GraphQL for this is that we get all the cool tools. So I have here GraphQL Voyager, where I now am able to look at that schema that we were looking at and see, OK, so page, if I'm a front-end developer, I can come to this documentation and be like, OK, for the page, I need component. I need to have a featured prop and a sections prop, and it needs to take this type. And you can see how using this and even using this with TypeScript and getting the types out of that, you essentially have your props done, right? So we have our section, which is a shelf. It's going to have tiles with video tiles, and there's our video tile data. So what does it look like to actually build a UI with this? Well, let's take a look. I'm going to give a very kind of like pared down example of what it might look like to work with this. It's certainly not all-encompassing. Here we have our slideshow component. So we're building out our component library, right? We're decoupling the component library from rendering. So we have to have a component library in the front end. And we've described it in the back end with our schema. So now let's implement it. So here we have our slideshow. It's going to have some local state. Really, the front end is only concerned with local state. The back end doesn't care about that. So we'll have our timed kind of slideshow. And it's going to dig into that items field that we talked about. And that items field is going to contain slides, because this is a slideshow. And then what we could do is kind of generically render the children of the slideshow, passing the local state along, but then also passing along the data we got from the API. Here we have like a basic slide component just showing that we're filling out our component library. And then we have kind of the glue. This is where the contract is made, the contract between the schema and the component library. We create these dictionaries, and this is just one way that I thought of that you could wire these things up. But you can see that these dictionaries map to our GraphQL interfaces that we talked about, featured, sections, and then I kind of created this catch-all for the sake of the demo. So what we're going to do when we go to render these things is we're going to take a dictionary, take the component and the respective data. We're going to pass that component string that we talked about into the dictionary, go find it, and then we have this generic idea of a component, right? And we're going to just spread the data from the API into that component. And there we have it. We are generically rendering a component that we received from our API. And here's how we might wire that together in our app. We could take our featured dictionary, pass the featured field from our page response, take our sections dictionary, pass our sections. Right? So we're mapping over the sections there, rendering each section using that dictionary. So that's how we get our shelves to fill out on that home page. So there's some hard parts, that's for sure. We pulled more I guess, concerns into the backend. And we started to build a more monolithic app. So when the iOS team and the Android team have some fragmented business logic, if it's centralized, we have to handle that, right? We have some branch in our code that says, well, if we're iOS, then we want to do this. If we're Android, we want to do this. And this works best when applications across platforms are generally have similar business goals. So even variance in style across platforms could cause issues. If the slideshow is completely different, there might be different props that are needed, right? So you end up having to kind of handle some of those edge cases. And then finally, pagination and lazy loading took some pretty creative solutions. But we solved that by just creating another component. So we just created a lazy shelf. And that lazy shelf doesn't have any tiles in it, right? But it has instructions on how to query for the shelf that you're looking for, right? So it's going to say, hey, use this GraphQL query, use these variables, kind of like the Helios example I gave earlier, and it's going to basically give you instructions on how to lazy load your shelf. So upon rendering that lazy shelf, you're going to get a shelf back and just swap it out. Same thing for pagination. The good parts, right? What this provided for MVC was simpler front ends. The front ends were really only concerned with generically rendering components from the API, definitely some UI local state that is handled when you're toggling things open and closed, and then reporting user information, things like that, and analytics. Shared business logic. When we implement a feature, it rolls out across platforms. So if we want to create a new shelf, we just create a new shelf in the API, and it starts showing up in the front ends. They don't have to do anything as long as they're respecting the API format. We get shared A/B testing and feature flagging. So we can flip on an A/B test, and it rolls out across platforms without changes. As long as they have the components implemented, they're good. We get design consistency with our component libraries. And we can do some optimizations on the server that they couldn't do on the front ends. So should everyone use this? No. That's not what this talk is about. All of those other patterns we talked about are perfectly great patterns. But I think this is a good pattern for maybe content sites that are media publishing heavy and need to show a lot of personalized data to users. Maybe not a good idea for a very transactional tool of sorts, I guess. I guess the big thing I'm leaving you with here is think outside the box. GraphQL can do some pretty cool stuff. Thanks.